You know, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, the impact of something as simple as what we choose to eat.
Yeah.
I was reading this thing that said, like, if everybody just ate more plants, we could, like, prevent millions of deaths every year.
Wow.
And drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions, you know, by 2050. It's pretty wild. Like, it makes you rethink dinner.
It totally does.
Yeah.
And you know what it's like trying to figure out what's actually good for you and good for the planet these days?
Yeah.
It's like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
There's just so much information out there.
It's completely overwhelming.
It is. And that's why we're here with you today, to help kind of cut through the noise and figure out what actually matters.
Exactly right. We're doing a deep dive on this book, Plant-Based Diets for Succulence and Sustainability. And one of the things that struck me about it is that it's not just about, you know, giving things up or being restrictive. It really dives into all these different aspects of plant-based diets.
Yeah.
You know, like, are they actually affordable? Are they culturally acceptable?
Yeah.
Do we have the technology to make it work? And what about the politics of it all, you know?
Absolutely.
But the thing that really hooked me was this idea of succulence. This, you know, that idea of food being juicy and delicious and mentally satisfying.
Yeah.
You know, and how that can actually go hand in hand with being strong and healthy and sustainable.
That's a really important point, and it's one of the things that the book does really well. It shifts the focus away from what you're giving up and really highlights what you gain by embracing plant-based foods.
Totally.
And for you listening today, we want to break down the core arguments
Yeah.
and really look at the impact this way of eating has on your health, the environment, and society as a whole. We're going to try to keep it interesting and easy to follow.
Exactly. We're not going to get bogged down in the details. We're going to give you the good stuff, the stuff you need to know. All right, so let's dive in. The book really hits hard on the environmental urgency of all this. Like, it doesn't sugarcoat it.
It doesn't.
It says that tackling climate change isn't just a good idea. It's like the most crucial thing we need to be doing right now.
Exactly. And one of the chapters by David Cleveland really dives into that. He makes a strong argument that plant-based diets are a key tool for dealing with climate change.
Right.
He argues that a big shift in what we eat could drastically reduce those food-related emissions,
Yeah.
potentially enough to make a real difference in global warming.
And when you think about it, and all the land we use to raise animals, all the resources that go into livestock, it just makes you realize how inefficient meat-heavy diets really are.
It does.
Not to mention all the habitat destruction, you know, driven by animal agriculture. It's a pretty sobering thought, and it definitely speaks to your interest in understanding these major global issues.
For sure. And this brings us back to that idea of succulence, which the book defines as food that's full of flavor, desirable, and even mentally satisfying.
Right. It's about shifting the narrative around plant-based eating. You're not missing out. You're actually gaining all these amazing things.
Yeah.
You know, it's that aha moment when you realize this is about a richer, more fulfilling way of eating that benefits both you and the planet.
It doesn't have to be all or nothing either, you know?
Yeah.
It's about finding what works for you and making those changes gradually.
Exactly. So for 2025, let's make it a goal to explore at least one new plant-based recipe every week, something that really emphasizes flavor and enjoyment.
Absolutely.
Right. So to really grasp why this shift is so important, the book dives into the whole industrial agriculture system, and it's not exactly a pretty picture.
It isn't. It talks about how government subsidies for this industrial grain oil seed livestock complex have really shaped what ends up on our plates.
And that's a mouthful, right? It's basically this huge interconnected system where large-scale farms are churning out grains like corn and soy. A lot of it's genetically modified, by the way. And a huge chunk of that goes to feeding livestock.
Right. And those subsidies from the government really play a role in all of this.
Yep.
They influence what farmers are growing and ultimately what we're eating a lot of, which is processed food.
Yeah, and the book points out that in North America, we actually spend a relatively small part of our income on food.
That's true.
But the problem is that a lot of that cheap food is highly processed and not exactly good for us. It's like this focus on low food prices comes with a whole bunch of hidden costs.
It does. And those costs include things like damage to the environment, healthcare expenses linked to those processed foods and animal products.
Right. And then there's the social cost, you know, the decline of family farms, the loss of traditional farming knowledge. It all adds up.
It does. It's pretty staggering, actually. The book says these hidden costs are in the trillions of US dollars annually.
Trillions. Wow. So I guess our second actionable takeaway for 2025 is to be more aware of where our food comes from and support those local farmers markets whenever we can.
I think that's a great idea. And it's not just about the environment. This brings us to the health and well-being aspect of plant-based eating.
Yeah, this part of the book was really interesting. It talks about this concept of whole food plant-based, or WFPB eating.
Right.
It's all about focusing on foods that are whole or minimally processed, like fruits, veggies, grains, and legumes. And it gets into the science of why these diets are so good for you.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how they compare these WFPB foods to animal-based foods.
Yeah.
Animal products tend to be higher in saturated fat, and they contain cholesterol, which you won't find in plant foods at all.
Right. And even though there's always some debate about fats and cholesterol, the general consensus is that limiting saturated fat is good for your heart.
It is, and the book actually addresses that whole butter is back thing that was going around.
I remember that.
They talk about the American Heart Association's big review from a few years back, and they found that when people swapped out saturated fats for those healthier unsaturated fats found in plants, it led to a big decrease in cardiovascular disease.
Right, so it's not about replacing those saturated fats with just anything.
Exactly.
Like refined carbs and sugar aren't going to do you any favors. The AHA was really clear about that.
They were. They said you got to keep both saturated fats and added sugar low while you're upping your intake of whole grains and those good plant-based fats.
Okay, so takeaway number 3 for 2025 is to start incorporating more of those unsaturated fats into our diets. Things like avocados, nuts, and seeds, olive oil, all that good stuff.
That's delicious.
I know, right? Okay, so let's talk about the impact of all this on those big, scary diseases. Let's start with cardiovascular disease, which the book says is the #1 killer worldwide.
Right, and the evidence for WFPB eating preventing heart disease is pretty solid. There have been big studies like the Adventist Health Study 2 that showed way lower rates of death from heart problems in people who mostly ate plant-based proteins compared to those who ate more animal protein.
Oh, there's a clear link there.
There is. And the book also points out that the decrease in deaths from heart disease we've seen over the past few decades is largely thanks to reducing things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and smoking.
Right. And what about cancer? The book talks about how plant-based diets might help lower the risk of certain types of cancer, like breast cancer, colon cancer, ovarian cancer, and prostate cancer.
There's definitely a lot of research going on right now about the connection between diet and cancer.
Yeah.
And while more research is always good, the book does mention some studies that suggest a link between eating more plant-based foods, which are packed with antioxidants and phytochemicals, and a lower incidence of those specific cancers.
Right. So it's not a guaranteed thing, but it's definitely worth considering.
Yes.
And what about type 2 diabetes? That seems to be another area where diet plays a big role.
It does. The book talks about a connection between red meat and processed meat, especially the heme iron in them, and a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Really?
Yeah. On the other hand, plant-based diets have shown some real promise in both preventing and managing the condition.
So that's our 4th takeaway for 2025. We're going to try to cut back on red and processed meats and explore plant-based options like lentils and beans.
Great idea.
Yeah.
And it's not just about those big life-threatening diseases either.
Yeah.
The book even mentions a study that showed vegetarian diets are linked to lower blood pressure.
Wow, so there are benefits across the board.
There really are. Now, of course, one of the first things people ask about plant-based diets is, where do you get your protein?
Oh, I know that one.
Right. But the book addresses that head on. It says that getting enough protein on a plant-based diet is totally doable as long as you eat a variety of plant foods and get enough calories overall.
Right, it's not as hard as some people think.
Not at all. And they really emphasize pulses, things like beans, lentils, peas, chickpeas. They call them chief protein foods for humans.
Makes sense.
And not only are they great sources of protein, they're also super sustainable. And they come with a bunch of other health benefits like iron bone health, diabetes prevention, brain health, the list goes on.
They're like little nutritional powerhouses.
They really are. And then there's soy, which often gets a bad rap, but the book does a good job of debunking those myths.
Yeah, soy seems to have a lot of misinformation surrounding it.
It does. The book explains that the isoflavones in soy don't actually have the same strong estrogenic effects in humans that some people worry about. In fact, animal products actually contain natural animal estrogens.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah. It also tackles those myths about soy and cancer and thyroid problems, suggesting that some of that negative info might actually be coming from marketing by the meat and dairy industries.
Makes you think.
It does. So apart from pulses and soy, what other good protein sources does the book highlight for plant-based eaters?
Well, they mention whole grains, which have a decent amount of protein, and quinoa nuts and seeds. There are even some newer sources like water lentils that are showing a lot of promise.
No, haven't heard of those.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. So there's really a wide variety of options out there for plant-based protein.
It sounds like it. And what about fats? That's always a big topic when it comes to diet.
It is. The book says that moderation is key, but it recognizes that healthy plant-based fats can actually make you feel fuller and make the food more enjoyable. The important thing is to not overdo it because too much fat can lead to weight gain.
Right.
But having some healthy fats in your diet can make it more sustainable in the long run.
For sure.
So what about supplements? Are there any nutrients that people on plant-based diets need to be extra careful about?
The book briefly talks about the need for vitamin D supplementation, especially for people who live in places with limited sunlight, particularly during the winter. They also talk about omega-3 fatty acids and recommend eating plant-based sources like flax seeds and chia seeds. And for some people, algae-based omega-3 supplements are a good option.
So it's worth getting those levels checked and talking to your doctor about potential supplementation. That's takeaway number 5 for 2025.
Good one.
What about different life stages like pregnancy, childhood, and older age? Are there any special considerations for plant-based diets?
The book actually references the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which says that well-planned vegan and vegetarian diets can be healthy for people at all stages of life.
That's good to know.
Yeah. They do emphasize making sure you're getting enough of certain nutrients like calcium, vitamin B12, and folate during pregnancy, breastfeeding, and as you get older. And for kids too, of course.
Of course. So it's really about planning and making sure you're covering all your bases.
It is.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little and talk about the bigger picture, the systemic changes that the book says are so important.
All right. The book makes it very clear that the way we produce and consume food globally is just not sustainable.
Right.
It's negatively impacting our health, the environment, and even social equity. And there's a growing awareness that we need to make some serious changes.
Yeah, we can't keep doing things the same way and expect different results.
Exactly. Even in the discussions about climate change, there's this increasing recognition that we need to transform our food systems, and that means big changes in what we eat.
Right. And the book specifically highlights the Lancet report on the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. It basically says that the current system is encouraging unhealthy behaviors and making it harder to implement policies that could help fix things.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
It's like we're stuck in this cycle where private profits are prioritized over the well-being of society as a whole, and the people who are most vulnerable are often the ones who suffer the most.
So it's a complex problem with no easy solutions.
It is. But the book does offer some ideas for moving forward. It talks about the need for government policies, especially those related to agricultural subsidies, to be more aligned with our health and environmental goals.
Right.
And it points to some positive examples, like what California is doing to promote more plant-based options in school meals.
Yeah, that's a great initiative. And the book also talks about how we need to reconnect with where our food comes from and start seeing nutritious food as a public good, something that everyone should have access to.
Absolutely. They even bring up some historical examples like Canada's early food rules, which linked good nutrition to national strength. It shows how food has always been seen as essential for our collective well-being.
It's a fundamental thing, really. And on the consumer side, there's a growing demand for sustainably produced food, which is driving the market for plant-based alternatives. Yeah. So there's definitely a shift happening.
There is. So for 2025, let's make a commitment to support those policies that promote sustainable agriculture and access to healthy plant-based foods.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about policy. Either education and awareness are crucial too.
Yeah, people need to have the information and the tools to make informed choices.
Exactly. The book talks about the importance of food literacy and highlights some encouraging developments, like the growing number of medical schools that are offering electives in lifestyle medicine. That means future doctors are going to be more equipped to provide guidance on nutrition and lifestyle.
That's great to hear. And what about the role of schools? I mean, if we can teach kids about food sustainability and healthy eating habits early on, that could make a huge difference.
It could. And the book mentions some great initiatives like Farm to Cafeteria Canada and Think and Eat Green at school, which are working to connect students with local healthy foods and teach them about the food system.
That's fantastic. It's like planting seeds for a healthier future.
It really is. And the book also touches on the ethical aspects of food choices, the whole animal welfare issue that motivates many people to go plant-based.
Right. It introduces the perspective of the animal liberation movement and talks about the role of farm sanctuaries in changing how we view farm animals and promoting a more compassionate vegan lifestyle.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that more and more people are identifying as vegan these days, driven by a combination of ethical health and environmental concerns.
It's definitely a growing movement. So as we wrap things up, how do we actually get to this succulent sustainability that the book talks about?
Well, the book makes a strong case that eating more plant-based foods and being physically active offers one of the best ways to prevent many of the interconnected challenges we're facing. It emphasizes the need for a food system that values quality, ethical production and a renewed respect for food itself.
And farmers are really at the heart of all this, aren't they?
They are. The book highlights their role as leaders in adopting sustainable practices and stresses the importance of supporting them in that transition. It even introduces this idea of systems thinking as a framework for tackling these complex, interconnected problems.
That's pretty high-level thinking.
It is. But ultimately, it's about using the best available information to guide our policies and strategies and make sure we're moving in the right direction.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into plant-based diets and sustainability?
Well, the big one is that eating more plants is incredibly beneficial for your health. And it's also a powerful way to address climate change and contribute to a more sustainable food system.
For sure. And understanding how our current industrial agriculture system works and the impact of your own food choices can empower you to make more informed decisions that are aligned with your values.
Absolutely. And the good news is that going plant-based is easier than ever before.
Yeah.
There's more scientific evidence, more support, and more delicious options than ever.
That's a great summary. It really brings it all together. And for a final thought for our listeners, think about this. What's one small, manageable change you could make in your own eating habits this week to move towards a more succulent and sustainable future?